Hello, Stanton students. Welcome to your lecture on the Americas, where we'll go over some of the early civilizations that pop up in the Americas. We're going to be covering key concept 1.3 and 2.2. 1.3 includes the development and interactions of early agricultural, pastoral, and urban societies. And so we're going to be looking for the differences between the early societies that we've talked about, early civilizations of the Eastern Hemisphere, so Mesopotamia and the Indus River Valley and the Nile. What are the differences between those early civilizations and those that form in the Americas? And we're going to see the rise of American empires. Just a couple, the Maya and the Moche, which is a small empire that will later form into the South American Inca Empire. So, by the end of this lecture and through your readings, you want to be able to identify the early civilizations of Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is the area that includes Central America and Mexico, and South America, and describe what those characteristics are. And think about how these early American civilizations will later impact those of the Aztecs and the Inca, which we'll talk about later on in a later lecture. Okay, so just to orient you, this is the area of the world that we're talking about. Like I said, we're not going to discuss the Aztec and Inca empires in this lecture. That'll come later. But you can see the area where the Maya form is just south of Mexico. And the Olmec will be the precursors to the Aztecs, so they'll form in Mexico. And then we have the Chavan and Moche civilization. The Chavan isn't listed on this map, but they are both in South America, north of where the Inca Empire will develop, and the area of what is modern-day Peru today. And if you're looking at this map, you can picture just to the right of that shaded brown section in South America, that's where the Andes mountain region will lie. So we'll talk about the geography in both of these places and how they contribute to their respective civilizations. Okay, so one of the earliest of these American civilizations are the Olmecs. Like I said, they are a precursor to the Aztec Empire. And what they're most known for are their giant carvings of these ancestral figures, their heads in particular. And so many of these heads have been found. The largest, you can see, it weighs more than 25 tons, so they're huge, enormous carvings. And most of what we know from this civilization, and as well some of the others in South America, most of this comes from archaeological evidence as well. And it is believed that these carvings were made as a way to commemorate either rulers that had successes in warfare that contributed to the spread of the Olmec civilization, or that they were simply a way to commemorate ancestors, people who came before them. And not necessarily a specific individual, but more to be a general ancestor that developed into the Olmecs. So the Olmecs were known for more than just their giant carved head figures. They created objects like these seen on this page, and a lot of these had practical purposes as well. Like you can see the hand axes that were carved in that middle picture. And we can divide these early civilizations into different periods, and typically it's a formative period, which means they were just developing, or early formative period. The middle formative period would be when they were developed and thriving, and then there's typically a declining period as well. So these were created during that middle formative period when they would have been thriving. We do know that the Olmec developed agriculture. It's part of the reason why they thrived, and that they did have their own writing system, but that we're not able to decipher still. Alright, so this is just to give you an idea about where the Moche and the Chavan are. We're going to talk about the Chavan here in a minute. And we're just going to highlight the city of Teotihuacan in modern-day Mexico. But this was an ancient Mesoamerican city that had a huge role in trade at the time. Okay, so the Chavan in South America, similarly like the Olmecs in Mesoamerica, is kind of a founding civilization for this later empire. In Mesoamerica, that later empire will be the Aztecs. Here in South America, this later empire will be the Inca. And I can't stress enough how much a role the geography plays and how it shapes these early civilizations. And one big difference that you want to keep in mind between these civilizations and those in the Eastern Hemisphere, Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley, the Yellow River, is that really these American civilizations did not domesticate animals like those in the Eastern Hemisphere. In the Eastern Hemisphere, they domesticated horses, oxen, pigs, and we just don't see that to the same extent here in the Americas. But something that they did do is they domesticated llamas, and they used them for pack animals. Pardon me. So, like I mentioned, this coastline of South America, the Andean mountain range, essentially runs down this western part of South America all the way down the coastline through Peru on down to what's now modern day Chile. It forms the border between Chile and Argentina. And so these early civilizations basically were formed at the foothills of these mountains, and very much the mountains played a huge role in their development. And so the llamas were mainly were used as pack animals, ways to transport goods through these mountains. But they did grow crops like maize, which is corn, and potatoes, and large urban centers developed much like the ones that we saw early on. Okay, we're going to move on to the Mayans. And this is the area, what's modern-day Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico is the area that we're talking about, where the Mayan civilization sprung up. The Olmecs will be, like I said, kind of more west, northwest, towards the southern part of Mexico. Okay. Alright, just to emphasize again what part geography plays in the development of this civilization. This part of Guatemala, you can see here in this picture, you can see the outline. This picture to the right, you can see the outline of what's modern day Guatemala, and all of these triangles here are sites where we have found Mayan archaeological sites. And so up in the north towards the Yucatan Peninsula is a little different geography than what's in Guatemala. It's the jungles of Guatemala where the Mayans came about. You can see this picture down at the bottom of some of the Mayan temples. I actually took this picture. You can see that their pyramids served a large function in their cities. They grew. The Mayans developed massive cities, and the Mayan civilization started very early on, around 2800 BCE, but we wouldn't say that they really reached their height until about 300 CE. So from around 300 to CE to 900 is when they really reached their height. And you can also add to that, it's about 800 to the year 1000 is when they begin to decline. And I'll talk a little bit about their decline here in a minute. But they're known for their mathematics, for their astronomy, and for their writing. They not only developed a hieroglyph type of writing, they had both a mixture. They had hieroglyphs that represented pictures like you would see in Egypt or in China, but they also had hieroglyphs that would represent sounds that you would make, so something similar to an alphabet. So their writing was kind of a mixture of hieroglyphs and, I wouldn't say alphabet, but glyphs or hieroglyphs that represented sounds that they would make. Alright, and you can kind of tell from this picture at the bottom just how, you can see the outline of these trees here. I'll show you another picture in a minute, but you can see how these cities were really centered within the jungle. And so, the jungle would form this canopy being like a ceiling of trees overhead, which would sometimes make farming difficult. And so they had a unique way of farming, and we'll see here again how the animals of the jungle play a large part in Mayan culture and how they viewed their gods, and how people use those gods in rituals and ceremonies. If you want to make one important distinction between, you can see that these buildings pretty much look like pyramids down here, and so if you want to make a distinction between the pyramids here of the Mayans and the pyramids of the Egyptians, you would say that their function or the way that they were used would be the biggest difference. For Egyptians, their pyramids were mainly, they were simply burial chambers, right? Those pyramids were used solely as a way to bury their leader, their ruler, their pharaoh. Seems like a very shallow use of those pyramids. That's my opinion. Anyways, but these temples, or these pyramids, were sometimes used to bury rulers as well. There were chambers in some of the backs of these pyramids, but mainly they were used as ritual centers. So at the tops of these pyramids, they would have ceremonies, and at times, mostly the Mayans are well known, as well as the Aztecs, for what's called bloodletting. This is sacrificial, either cutting or sacrificing humans at the tops of these pyramids. Alright, so you can see in this picture here, this is a picture from one of the first excavations of Tikal, one of the major Mayan cities. But you can see how the trees have just overtaken it, and really how these cities were kind of centered in these jungles, or low-lying rainforests is what they would be called, but essentially jungles. So like I mentioned, their environment played a large role in their culture and their religion as well. And so one of their major gods, named Quetzalcoatl, was part serpent, part bird, and he's one of the main gods. The Mayans were polytheistic, and so they had many gods, and one of the gods was they had a creation story that the people were grown out of stalks of corn, which is kind of an interesting idea, and tells you like how closely they felt about themselves in regards to their environment. And so I mentioned in the previous slide that they did practice bloodletting and sacrifices, and many times these were voluntary sacrifices, people who gave themselves up as a way to please the gods. And that might sound strange to us, but a way to think about that is that, they had a god for certain hills that surrounded the area, and they really believed that this god needed to feed off of the blood of these sacrifices in order to survive and in order to be happy. And so you could think of how do we, if we live at this time, how are we going to explain an earthquake, what an earthquake is? Well, you could explain that as one of the gods not being fulfilled enough, or not, getting enough food, basically. And so that would be the purpose of it. All right. So I mentioned the Mayans were polytheistic. They believed that gods had that they controlled everything about their lives. And so for this reason, of course, much like the other civilizations, priests hold a high status in Mayan societies, and they believed that those priests had a direct connection to the gods. And like I mentioned, many of their gods symbolized the animals around the rainforest. And so they had ones that were jaguars. Jaguars are an animal that exist in the Guatemalan rainforest. And as well as snakes and bats, like I mentioned. And as I mentioned, sometimes they would give or have voluntary sacrifices, people who gave themselves up voluntarily for sacrifices, but they also used prisoners captured in war. And at this point I want to mention, I mentioned that we're going to be talking about the empires of the Americas. We can call the Aztecs and the Inca an empire because they have a centralized authority. However, the Mayans are not that case. We would not consider the Mayans an empire because they're separated into what we might describe as kingdoms, basically. Each one of their cities had their own political system. However, all these cities around the area of Guatemala did share common language, common religious beliefs, common culture. All right, and then one popular reference about the Mayans. Most people are familiar about the Mayan calendar, especially since all of the references about 2012 a couple of years ago, and the misconception about that was that Mayans predicted the end of the world in December 2012. However, that's really just the end of the Mayan calendar, and it was predicted that there would be some change at that point of the end of the calendar, not necessarily that the world was going to end or there was some apocalyptic message ingrained in their calendar. But they did have a sophisticated type of calendar that had, for their year, 260 days. And each day of the week had a name associated with an animal. Typically, like we have a name for each day of the week. And this would have been the basis or basically the standard calendar used in Mesoamerica for hundreds of years. Okay, now we're going to go back to the Moche in South America. I'm not trying to purposefully hop around, I'm just trying to go chronologically. So we had, the earliest civilizations, the Olmecs, and then the Chavan, the Mayans, and Moche. But there's not a lot of evidence for the Moche culture. But we know a little bit about their language and the dialect that was spoken at that time in this area called Trujillo. But something that they're known for mainly is their pottery here, which we'll see in a minute. Okay, so you can see here the pottery that the Moche made was fairly lifelike, especially at least for that time. And the pottery that they did make was supposed to represent the people in the upper parts of society. So we're talking about priests and warriors. But just to describe a little bit of the rest of the social structure of the Moche, the middle class would have been artisans, farmers, fishermen, servants, and then slaves and beggars. So that's a pretty sophisticated social structure at that time. If we want to compare that to the other societies we've talked about in this lecture, the Mayans, for example, held priests and kings at the top of their social structure, of course. And then would have had warriors being someone who was prominent as well, and then merchants, and then you have essentially everyone else lumped into a lower, middle class, and then you have a class of slaves. And so they have a little bit, quite a sophisticated social structure for such an early civilization. Okay, and then finally, like I mentioned before, Teotihuacan is this city that's near the southern part of Mexico. It's close to where the Aztecs will develop their center or their civilization. You shouldn't confuse this with Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan will be the city of the Aztecs later on. But this was an earlier city, Teotihuacan, which, like it says, was called the place where one becomes a god. One of these early urban centers of the Americas. It was a trading center, and you can see this picture on the left is an image shot from the Pyramid of the Moon, and on the right is kind of showing you where it was located at. Okay, so some questions for you to consider. I want you to think about, of course, like I mentioned, how these civilizations differ from the early civilizations in the Eastern Hemisphere that we mentioned before. Think about the ways geography played a part. And so that question comes up, how big of a role do you think geography played in how these early civilizations developed? And thanks for listening.